Today's video on upgrades I can't afford is about engine cooling. Last year when I was looking to buy the Speedmaster, I did look at a couple of second-hand ones and they had melted boot marks on the cases. This is the cases, not the barrels or the exhaust, on the actual engine cases. They get so hot they can melt a leather boot. And for me, when I'm riding, it burns the inside of my leg. Even through thick biker jeans, it's really painful. And in the summer, when you've got the high ambient heat anyway, the extra heat radiating from the engine, it can make it awful. Even out on the motorway, it's a stunner. So what are the potential solutions? Well, I've had a look, and there aren't so many really. The first one is, perhaps predictably, a new radiator core. One company says that cooling capacity is increased by 30% over a standard radiator. They use high-density 22mm cores that enhance cooling efficiency. Apparently there are lots of different tube core sizes they can use, as well as fin heights, so the radiator itself could be thicker. Compared to a stock radiator, a Triumph radiator, which is £620, a new core might start at just £250 or £300, and if you use the standard finishing rails in the top and bottom tank, that works out comparatively cheap, and it's certainly a convenient sort of a solution. I have looked at aftermarket radiators for Bonnevilles, and there just aren't any. Another option, one that I certainly prefer, is a potential oil cooler. Now again, I'm coming from a Sportster, so I do tend to compare it to that. I'm familiar with the Harley Sportster. If you wanted an oil cooler on your Sportster, it's easy, you can buy a factory cooler. If you buy Harley Davidson, you know it'll fit, you know the parts are fairly good quality, you know what you're getting. If you did want to fit an oil cooler to your Sportster, it's a very simple fit. The oil filter is right underneath where the oil cooler would mount. It's right at the top and at the front of the engine, so it's very straightforward. I did find one rider who rides one of the big Harley Davidsons, the Taurus, I can't remember which one, but that's running the M8 motor or the Milwaukee 8 motor. The M8s come from the factory with a liquid-cooled head anyway, but some of them, particularly the big Taurus, they also have a built-in oil cooler. But this fella, he put an aftermarket additional oil cooler on, and I was very interested to see that when he measured the oil temperature before and after, he got 15 degrees cooler oil. So I looked at oil coolers for this Bonneville, oil coolers for liquid-cooled Bonnevilles, they just don't exist. There are some for air-cooled Bonnies, but that's no good to me. One user did say that if you did try and fit an oil cooler to your Bonneville, it would need, he said, engineering to fit. You'd have to drill the cases and so on. It's not straightforward. Another option I looked at is a heat exchanger. It's not something I've come across before, but apparently they're fairly common on many vehicles. The one that I could find the clearest picture of is from a Fiat Barchetta. On the right of the diagram is the oil filter, and that has a hole through the centre, and oil pumps to and from the oil filter into the engine through the oil pump. Then there's the heat exchanger. It draws coolant from the existing cooling circuit, so there's very little extra work to do. It has inlet and outlet pipes so that cool coolant can flow in and hot coolant can flow out again. Inside the heat exchanger are tubes, and the oil flows through the tubes while being submerged in the coolant, so that the oil flowing into and out the filter is cooled. Now on the Barchetta, the oil filter is mounted next to the engine. There's a comparatively large amount of space, it's an easy fit. But on the Speedmaster this is impossible. The oil filter is directly underneath the engine. There's no space. If you did put a heat exchanger between the oil filter and the engine, the oil filter would just scrape on the road. So again, a heat exchanger, although it's a good potential idea, it would need some significant engineering to fit. And also I have reservations because the cooling system on the Speedmaster, it's already overstretched. It doesn't do a good enough job as far as I'm concerned. I think if you gave it more work to do, if it had to cool the oil as well, it would make a bad situation worse. So although heat exchangers are small and they're neat, I don't know that they've got the volume to cool the oil sufficiently, certainly on the Speedmaster. So it seems that technically and financially, the most sensible option is a radiator core. I can imagine there'll be many watching this video on excessive engine heat and they'll be shouting, exhaust! And particularly they'll be thinking of catalytic converters. Well, exhaust pipes, they chuck out some nasty old gases. Specifically, they're carbon monoxide, which is obviously very poisonous. There are nitrogen oxides that cause smog and apparently acid rain. And there are hydrocarbons, which are also a contributor to smog. And I don't imagine that breathing in hydrocarbons, whether they're burnt or unburnt, would do anybody any good. But to my surprise, when I was looking into this, it seems that 90% of these horrible compounds a catalytic converter can sort out. So specifically, carbon monoxide is converted into carbon dioxide, and the nitrogen oxides are broken down into nitrogen gas and oxygen, and the hydrocarbons are converted into carbon dioxide and water. It's not ideal. Catalytic converters produce carbon dioxide, but it is a huge step in the right direction. So what exactly is a catalytic converter, and why does it make any influence on the engine heat? A cat is essentially just a tube, or sometimes a box shape, that is part of the exhaust. Inside these tubes or boxes there's a ceramic honeycomb, sometimes it's made of metal. And these honeycombs are coated in rare and expensive metals, specifically platinum, palladium and rhodium. Now perhaps the genius of a catalytic converter is that there are no moving parts, there's nothing to control, there's no maintenance needed. It's the catalysts themselves that do all the work. And the catalysts here are the metals, and they inherently cause the gases to react. They literally convert them or change their chemistry. So for instance, 2 molecules of nitrogen dioxide is decomposed into 2 molecules of oxygen and 1 of nitrogen. It's awesome, it is so clever. So now I want to have a quick look at a catalytic converter case study. In October 2006, Ryan McKay, writing for Import Tuner magazine, wrote this. We took a lightly modded 1999 Honda Civic Si and found a difference of only 1 horsepower between a straight pipe and a 49 state legal catalytic converter. It seems foolish to pollute the air we all breathe. Hell, if you're only looking for those kinds of gains, just lose 10 pounds. That alone will make your car faster than adding 1 measly horsepower. We also found a 5 horsepower gain from losing the factory cat and changing it for the metallic core one. If the engine were to later receive more extensive mods, the benefits would probably be even greater. What it all boils down to is that a good aftermarket high flow cat can indeed flow almost as well as a straight pipe. All of this means that modern catalytic converters are not the performance killers the naysayers claim them to be. So what are the negatives? Why are bikers always hankering after deleting the catalytic converter? Well, first, we're going to ignore the fact that there is a cost, a weight penalty and a logistical penalty. You've got to mount it somewhere. We're going to ignore those things. We're going to ignore them because every vehicle you buy these days has to have a catalytic converter. It's a legal requirement. You cannot buy a new car or bike without one. So there's precious little point in bellyaching about it. If you really hate catalytic converters and other technological malarkey, then buy a classic. There are some superb classic cars and bikes. There's no need to worry that new ones have these things fitted. We're also going to ignore the performance penalty because it is irrelevant. It is too tiny. You are never going to notice a single horsepower on the street. We are going to take a moment to deride those who want a louder exhaust though. To me this is just grown-ups behaving like 17-year-olds. If a 17-year-old does rip the baffles out of his 125 and then says, well, even Grandad does it, it shows we are not setting a good enough example. Socially and ecologically, deleting a cat just to make the exhaust louder is irresponsible and immature. For me, the only real negative I can find with a catalytic converter is the heat it produces. Apparently, cats require 400 degrees to operate most effectively. Now that means that engines like diesels which run cooler, a catalytic converter isn't very effective. And of course, as you would expect, there are many sorts of cat systems. There is a 2-stage cat, for instance, that's on some cars. The first stage is called a pre-cat. It's mounted immediately after the manifold, right next to the engine, and it reaches a toasty 1500 degrees centigrade. It routinely glows red hot. Now, obviously a Triumph Speedmaster does not have that sort of system, but nevertheless, a cat under the engine with an internal temperature of 400 degrees, it's just double trouble. The engine runs too hot anyway. But before I deleted my cat from my Speedmaster, I want to do some testing. I need to know specifically what the temperatures are, particularly of the exhaust, the heads, the barrels and the cases, and I want to know what the difference made by a cat removal is. Now, so far we've looked at the engine heat issue, and really everything we've been talking about is all aimed at treating the symptoms and not curing the sickness. The sickness, so to speak, that we're talking about here is that the Triumph Speedmaster engine runs too hot. Now, Triumph, obviously, they have their engineering department, they know how the engine will function, and they're quite happy that the engine runs as it does and it's functioning within all parameters. But from a human perspective, it's not fine. It can be, anyway, very unpleasant in very hot weather. Now, in a previous Upgrade I Can't Afford video, I talked about the ECU tune, getting the engine tuned. I did this on my Sportster. I sent the ECM off to be reprogrammed and the results were wonderful. It was superb. It made a huge difference, not just to the running of the engine, but also to the exhaust sound, which I was very surprised about. And apparently it achieves this because it richens the mixture a little bit. So the engine runs better at slow speeds, which is what I wanted, but also the engine temperature was reduced. This was a tremendous shock to me. Before I had the tuning done on my Sportster, I could touch the engine, and if it was for more than just a fraction of a second, it would take skin off your hand. It was so horrible. After the tune, I could ride 100 miles and I could touch the barrels, and they were hot, obviously, but they were as hot as you'd expect them to be. They weren't evil. It made a huge difference just getting the tune done, and apparently that's because more fuel in the engine acts like a coolant. It's because you're sucking in cold liquid fuel, it cools the barrels, and the difference is enormous. I couldn't believe it. I never measured the temperature difference on the Sportster. I wish I had, but I didn't know it was going to be cooler, so I didn't know I was going to have to. But I'm confident it would be more than 15 degrees cooler. So for my Speedmaster, what would be the ideal situation? Well, the Upgrade I Can't Afford would be first an ECU remap or retune. I think that would be enough to reduce the engine temperature to more sensible levels. I would ideally like an oil cooler because they're neat and they're small, and I think that would be at least a 30 degree reduction in the overall engine operating temperature. That would be fine. So an oil cooler is small and it is neat, but technically and financially it's impractical. It might actually be, to all intents and purposes, impossible. So the only reasonable answer then is a recore of the radiator, perhaps having a thicker radiator in the same sized frame. But if the recore companies are confident they can improve cooling by 30%, well, that's got to be the way to go. And I think that recoring the radiator and retuning the engine, I think that would produce more than 30 degrees cooling, and that would be excellent. That's certainly the target, and I think it's a reasonable expectation. But at the end of the day, engine cooling is just another urgent upgrade I can't afford.